Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay. My name is Saran Tekelian. I'm a volunteer assistant director to Maggie here at the Ararat Museum. And I'd like to welcome you all today to the Jean Chapel for today's special lecture of Fridtjof Nansen, Humanitarianism and the Armenian Question in the Interwar period. Before introducing our featured guest speaker, I would like to first extend thanks on behalf of the Ararat Museum to you, our patrons, and to our partners and co-collaborators, the National Association of Armenian Studies and Research, NASR, both the Belmont and Los Angeles team, as well as the Promise Armenian Institute for especially helping to make today's experience possible. As a reminder, today's event is available on YouTube live stream and can be accessed on the Ararat Museum's channel. If you are interested in learning more about our upcoming events, please make sure to sign up for our email list before you leave today. Our next event is actually on Sunday, October 30th, and its featured presentation and topic is on Armenian weddings, so please make sure to attend. After today's lecture, we will have a question and answer session, so please be sure to gather any questions you may have as we listen to our guest presenter. Unfortunately, Dr. Taner Akçam was unable to attend today's event as it was his intention to introduce our special guest. He sends his regards and we wish him well in his absence. To lead us through today's presentation is the renowned director of the Postdam Lepsius House and associate lecturer at the University of Postdam, Dr. Roy Knocke. Dr. Knocke has traveled all the way from Postdam, Germany to be with us today. As an associate lecturer at the university, his focus is on the history of genocide, the history of humanitarianism, and the moral history of extreme political violence in the 20th century. Dr. Knocke has published publications on moral and social philosophical aspects of genocide, on Franz Werfel and the Armenian genocide, and on the origins, manifestations, and aftermath of political violence in the 20th century. Currently, he is working on a 4-volume annotated historico-critical edition of Johannes Lepsius' work on the Armenian question, a key figure in the German humanitarian pro-Armenian movement. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Knocke to tell us more about another key European figure of the early 20th century and a friend of the Armenians, Mr. Fridtjof Nansen. Dr. Knocke.
Yeah, Seda, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And before I will start my presentation, I also would like to thank the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and especially, of course, Maggie and her team from the Eskindjar Museum for this initiative and the warm hospitality I received in the last days. It was towards daybreak, June 17, 1925, when an overnight train from Tbilisi crossed the watershed between the valleys of the Kura and the Araks and arrived at Gümri station only a short time later. On the platform, a team of specialists was greeted by a large crowd and the People's Commissioner for Armenian Agriculture, Mr. Erzincan. The aim of that group was the prospect of fertilizing a swath of land in the arid plain of Zadarabat. The Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen was leading this team. In the penultimate years of his life, Nansen published a book titled Gjenem Armenia. So this is Norwegian, not the Turkish word for hell, but it's just translated as Travels Through Armenia. A travel report on Soviet Armenia, a historical homage to the oldest Christian people, and a prescient blunt analysis of the Armenian question in the interwar period. Who was this man whose mission was to cultivate lands in the plains of Zadarabat and therefore to give a homeland to probably 600,000 displaced Armenians. So I divided my presentation into 4 parts. I will speak a little bit about the early humanitarian work of Nansen. Then the second part is about the Nansen passport. Maybe some of you know this story. The third one is on Nansen and the exchange policy after the Greco-Turkish War. And last but not least, of course, I will talk about Nansen and the settlement plan for the Armenians in the interwar period. So I would like to start my presentation with a quote by Hannah Arendt to get an understanding of how a great number of people were situated and which political solutions were proposed after the collapse of the vast multi-ethnic Austrian-Hungarian, Russian and Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of World War I. I quote Arendt, "The calamity of the rightless is not that they are deprived of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, or of equality before the law and freedom of opinion, formulas which were designed to solve problems within given communities, but that they are no longer belong to any community whatsoever. Their plight is not that they are not equal before the law, but that no law exists for them, not that they are oppressed, but that nobody wants even to oppress them." End of quote. So this is from the origins of totalitarianism, and in this part Arendt describes how people were situated after World War I. And if you take a look at the numbers, or express the numbers, for the interwar period, you can say that there were around about 9.5 million refugees in Europe, and nearly 1/3 of them could be defined as statelessness. And that means they had no rights, they had nowhere to go, and I will elaborate on that later. So with the founding of the League of Nations in 1920, it was a plan to settle international disputes through negotiation and arbitration. So this is a quote by Harold Nicolson, who was in the British delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, and he, in his memoirs, he writes, I quote, "We came to Paris confident that the new order was about to be established. We left it convinced that the new order had merely followed the old. We preparing not peace only, but eternal peace. There was about us the halo of some divine mission. We must be alert, stern, righteous, and ascetic. For we were bent on doing great, permanent, and noble things." End of quote. So, the leaders of 1919 hoped, above all, to avoid the crudest attacks on the interests of certain minorities, and thus to prevent the hasty departure of refugees, which often occurred when a territory passed into other hands. It was assumed that national ambitions would be largely satisfied by geopolitical changes. State borders were to run where nationalities were divided, and inhabitants of those regions were to recognize the authority of the state. But this organization was not really prepared for the vast humanitarian and refugee crisis in the interwar period. So how did the international community cope with so many people in need and in the plight of statelessness? As we will see, this area was shaped by a melange of pragmatism, tentative models of aid and chagrin felt by many humanitarians. And so far, the humanitarian side of the interwar period coin was as crooked as the one characterized by the interplay of violence and modernity, namely the Armenian genocide. All these aspects can be studied vicariously through the life of the Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen, whose story as a humanitarian I would like to tell this afternoon. Nansen was both an intellectual man and a man of action. He was renowned in his days as an Arctic explorer, zoologist, oceanographer and diplomat. Before he became the High Commissioner for Refugees for the League of Nations in 1921, Nansen already embodied the dreams of his era. The aspiration to explore, studying and bringing nations forwards through a progressive scientific way of thinking. He was a public, almost heroic figure. The British writer and pacifist Vera Brittain once called him, I quote, a hero of every school child, end of quote. You can see some pictures here, Nansen as a man of sports, and the next one, you can see Nansen as an explorer on the right, and on the left, this is a publication, I mean, after his expeditions to the Arctic Circle, he published these 2 volumes, and this was a bestseller. So he got rich with this and was quite independent after that. It plays a role later on because he helped a lot of Armenians, let's say, out of his own pocket later on, but I will tell you the story later. Nansen earned his first diplomatic merits as an ambassador in London from 1906 to 1908. One of the main tasks was to negotiate a treaty with the other European representatives to guarantee Norway's sovereignty. So Norway was, there was a forced union between Norway and Sweden since 1814. And Norway said, no, we want this no more in 1905, and then there was, of course, diplomatic quarrels. So during this time, Nansen saw himself more as an explorer and scientist than as a politician. This changes with World War I, which he referred to as, I quote, the greatest confession of defeat of humanity, the bitter fruits of which mankind must eat for a generation, end of quote. So his first humanitarian engagement was actually in Norway itself. Due to the blockade of important international trade routes during World War I, famine threatened Scandinavia. After a month of negotiations in Washington, Nansen, as a special ambassador, arranged for the US to provide grain and other supplies. During the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, Nansen was an observer and lobbied for the recognition of the rights of small states. He became the president of the League of Nations Society in Norway and advocated Norway's membership in the League of Nations, which was effectuated in 1920. In the spring of 1920, Nansen was appointed by the League to set up relief plans for prisoners of war and expedite the repatriation of 2 groups: Russians still in Germany and prisoners of war from the Central Powers in Siberia. He had to learn about, coordinate and encourage the work already accomplished on their behalf by governments and organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, and to regularly report to the Council. Nearly 430,000 prisoners of war from 26 different nationalities were finally repatriated in less than 2 years. Interesting, Nansen was received in Moscow more based on a scientific success rather than as a League representative. This is quite an important point because the Bolsheviks later, the Soviets, saw the League of Nations as a capitalistic conspiracy. After that success, he was asked to fill the new position of High Commissioner for Refugees in 1921. The idea to have a responsible person in the League of Nations to coordinate centralized with individual governments, voluntary agencies and private individuals was quite new. But one should not assume that this position was particularly lavishly endowed. No money was spent on direct relief work. Only administration costs were covered. So that means money for direct relief work had to be raised from private individuals or channeled off in cooperations with other institutions like the International Red Cross. His main brief in this time was the resettlement of about 2 million Russian refugees displaced by the upheavals of the Russian Revolution. At the same time, he tried to tackle the famine in Russia. 30 million people suffered, which only succeeded partly through NGOs like the International Red Cross, due to no support by the countries of the League. The Realpolitik of the Western nations against the Bolsheviks and later Soviets disappointed Nansen and let him dashingly reply his well-known sentence, "Charity is Realpolitik." If one compares the efforts of the American Relief Administration, the ARA, and the Nansen team, as historian Karl-Emil Vogt has convincingly shown, the ARA mobilized more money to fight the famine. The idea in 1921 was not only to stem the tide of communism, but also to enter Russia, the heart of the communist threat to the world, with vast quantities of aid to undermine and eventually overthrow the regime. American policymakers believed that an effective response to the grievances of the Russian people would remove any reason to support the Bolsheviks and that a liberal regime could be established. As President Woodrow Wilson told Congress in 1919, I quote, "Bolshevism is advancing steadily westward and poisoning Germany. It cannot be stopped by force, but it can be stopped by food." End of quote. Herbert Hoover, the president of the ARA, proposed extending aid to encircle the Bolshevik state, which was by then desperately fighting the Allied-backed counter-revolutionists at a naval blockade. Following the example of the aid to Belgium during First World War, Hoover wanted a neutral commission to organize the relief work, which Nansen was to lead. Hoover thought in return for the relief work, the Bolsheviks would cease hostilities against their opponents in order to allow the Allies to distribute aid. The plan was based on the common liberal policy that the Bolsheviks' preponderance was dependent on the need of the people. If this diminished, the regime would be swayed and perished. Nansen enthusiastically lent his name to this project, which, as expected, met with a wall of rejection from the Bolsheviks, despite a diplomatic backdoor, which the People Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Georgy Chicheran, kept open. When a Bolshevik victory became apparent, Hoover renewed his proposal. Talks between the ARA and the Bolsheviks began in summer of 1920 and finally led to an agreement in 1921. So that's let's say the backstory, the beginnings. And I move now a little bit further to the concrete humanitarian work and the Nansen password. One main problem in the humanitarian efforts One main problem in the humanitarian efforts for refugees was the legal status without documentation. So this takes up Arendt's quote, the statelessness. So how can you move from one place to another, how you can find work, how you can, let's say, be visible without some documentation. That was a big question. In his novel, The World of Yesterday, the Austrian author Stefan Zweig described the freedom and movement that prevailed during the Belle Epoque. Back then, travelers could roam the world unhindered, provided that they had sufficient means to support themselves. I mean, Stefan Zweig writes in his novel that, he travels from Europe to India without any documentation. Nobody asks about it. You just have to be, I think, rich to do this traveling, have the funds, but there was no one who cared. World War I changes this open atmosphere dramatically due to implementing restrictive legislation requiring passports and visas. So how could all the refugees in the aftermath of World War I travel to other countries? Nansen discussed this issue with diplomats and legal scholars on a few international conferences and introduced in 1922 a simple and radical way which became known as the Nansen passport. After it had initially been invented exclusively for Russian stateless persons, the League of Nations conferences successively extended the international recognized identification and travel document to other groups, always defined according to national origin, within Armenian refugees since 1924, Aramaic Christians since 1928, also that means Assyrians, Arameans, Assyro-Chaldeans, It applied to survivors of the genocide and expulsion in the Middle East, and in the 1930s also to Jewish refugees from National Socialism. And you can see two passports here. The left one is a passport issued for Rebecca Edelstone, and she was born in Belarus. And she had to, she was a stateless person, and both are issued by the Nansen Bureau or in Great Britain. And on the right side you see an Armenian, Onik Isengian, born in Smyrna in 1907. And this was also issued in London. And usually it was not possible to, let's say, to travel out of the country who issued the Nansen passport. That was the first rule in the early days. So that means if you had a Nansen passport for Great Britain, you were allowed to travel to Great Britain, of course, with this Nansen passport, and you could find work and have identification and so on, but you couldn't leave the country. So this was forbidden and this was restricted, but they changed it later on. So that means these passports are both from 1928. So in this time it was possible. You can read it. I don't know if you can read it here. The certification is available for the holder to return to the United Kingdom. So they added this paragraph later on. And for example, in the case of Onik, he traveled to Britain, and if you take a look at the stamps in this passport later on, he traveled between Great Britain and Germany, had some business there, and then later on he moved to the US, got a medical degree at the Columbia University, and this passport is actually passed on by his son, or was passed on by his son. So it's not quite clear Maggie and we had the discussion, where are these passports today? Because we speak of around about 450,000 passports for all groups I mentioned. And some of them probably were destroyed because if you got new papers, you don't need the passport anymore. But in this case, it was passed on. So one has to, I didn't do that, but I think for future research you have to take a look a little bit on this, let's say, immigration policies, if it was all the same on all the checkpoints there. But usually you saw this, and then there was a second page with all the stamps on it. So the first refugee card in the world was developed for stateless refugees in the face of the Russian Revolution at their places of exile or stopovers, primarily in Western, Central and Eastern Europe, South America and the Far East. They thus formed the original group of political refugees of the 20th century. The certificate was a substitute identity card for undocumented people that authenticated their identity of origin instead of a home authority, at the same time created a substitute identity as a refugee in a new homeland. The group of eligible holders, for example, it was called for the Russians, for example, persons of Russian origin who had not acquired a new nationality, formed the first refugee definition according to a case-based, collective and national defined concept of refugee. The actual situation, statelessness, remained unspoken with regard to the bearers, as it did its course in the aggression of states against undesirable population groups. However, the special documents for stateless refugees was by no means accessible to all stateless persons, not even to all refugees among them. About 100,000 stateless persons in the successor states of the Habsburg Empire, especially Hungarians, Austrians, Ruthenians, Jews, or those affected by the German-Polish border shifts, remained excluded. Neither the intergovernmental conferences of the League of Nations nor the assemblies for the codification of international law could bring themselves to generalize the model status for all those affected or even to outlaw statelessness as international lawyers, minority representatives and humanitarian actors had been demanding since the beginning of the 1920s. Statelessness as a contemporary mass phenomenon and political problem was not solved in this way, contrary to what was hoped for all, therefore for the time, and is still widely assumed today. The certificate was not an international or even universal passport or permit, but a national substitute passport for foreigners, the issue of which was regulated internationally. In the interwar period, it was issued to about 440,000 people, and probably, we don't have exact numbers, 15 to 30,000 Armenians. Its limited scope is the ambivalence of refugee policy, measures after the First World War, and the function of the certificate to facilitate the departure of unwanted refugees and to relieve the host countries. Nevertheless, the practical effects were decisive. Proof of identity made it possible to find housing and also work. It was a necessary. It was important for the prerequisite for the bureaucratic side of a civic life with marriage, the acquisition of property, etc. Formalized refugee status entitled people to assistance from aid organizations or state bodies in some European countries, but required repeated certification at short intervals. It subjected the holder to grueling bureaucratic harassment, often experienced as humiliating or arbitrary. The writer Vladimir Nabokov remembers the Nansen certificate as a, I quote, highly inferior document of sickly green color. Its holder was little more than a paroled criminal. After 1 year, the certificate had to be renewed. It did not mean secure asylum status, but it formally protected against deportation and was the requirement for the individual visas that had to be obtained each time a person crossed the border, for which it was served as a supporting document. But return visas were permitted in 1926, however. Holders often did not dare to cross the borders for fear of losing their country of refuge after their homeland. Nevertheless, the Nansen refugees were considered privileged. Hannah Arendt sarcastically referred to them as the, I quote, aristocracy among the stateless people, end of quote. At the same time, the novel document aroused hope, as documented by numerous letters of request for issuance of the League of Nations passport in the archives of the League of Nations in Geneva. To sum up this part, the Nansen certificate was an internationally negotiated technical bureaucratic response to new kinds of political aggression against vulnerable populations, documenting identity instead of home country and establishing a new identity as a refugee. It can be interpreted as an attempt at normalization by means of provisional arrangement. The document, which was supposed to enable the mobility of stateless groups through their repatriation or naturalization to a country of refuge, actually created a substitute identity as a stateless person. So this was the part on the Nansen passport. I will now talk a little bit about Nansen and the exchange policy after the Greco-Turkish War. This is insofar important that because this population exchange policy was something new at this time because it was a policy. I mean, we look back and say, okay, it's always a forced way of it's a forced way to solve a conflict, but Nansen in this time thought it was a good way to do this, and this is of course a controversial aspect of Nansen's work, but an important one we have to take a look on. So the end of the Greco-Turkish War from 1919 to 1922 brought about with the defeat of the Greek army by the Turks and the fire of Smyrna that destroyed much of the city in September 1922 occurred while the Russian refugee question was still far from being settled. On September 19, 1922, the League's Assembly authorized Nansen to use the service of the Russian Refugee Organization to provide assistance for the relief of refugees from the Near East and to administer the money collected for this purpose. The Greek government gave Nansen full powers to proceed with negotiations for the exchange of prisoners of war. So, you know, Nansen had experience in that. And detained civilians between Greece and Turkey. In addition, thanks to the backing of the Allied High Commissioner, who administered the city of Constantinople after the general armistice of November 1918, he negotiated the terms of the reciprocal exchange of populations. The question then became part of the peace negotiations in Lausanne. Nansen and the leader of the Greek delegation, Eleftherios Venizelos, concurred on the necessity of making an exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey compulsory. Nansen left on an investigative trip to the Near East, accompanied by Noel Belker and Arthur Salter, head of the League Nations financial section. In October, while in Athens, he proposed to the head of all foreign and national organizations under a centralized coordination committee. The latter did not become operational as such, but turned out to be a clearinghouse for information through the publication of an information bulletin. In November, Nansen and his staff established a mission in Western Thrace, which relieved and settled 10,000 refugees. The population exchange was seen as the best form of minority protection in this time, as well as the most radical and humane remedy of all. Nansen believed that what was on the negotiation table at Lausanne was not ethno-nationalism, but rather a question that demanded quick and efficient resolution without minimum delay. He believed the economic component of the problem of the Greek and Turkish refugees deserved most attention. And so this is a quote by Nansen from the Nansen papers in the Geneva archives. And there he says, I quote, "Such an exchange will provide Turkey immediately and in the best conditions with the population necessary to continue exploitations of the cultivated lands, which the departed Greek populations have abandoned. The departure from Greece of its Muslim citizens would create the possibility of rendering self-supporting or great proportions of the refugees now concentrated in the towns and in different parts of Greece." Nansen recognized that difficulties were truly immense, acknowledging that the population exchange would require, I quote, "the displacement of populations of many more than 1 million people," end of quote. He advocated, I quote, "uprooting these people from their homes, transferring them to a strange new country, registering, valuing, liquidating their individual property when they abandon, and securing to them the payment of their just claims to the value of his property," end of quote. In September 1923, Nansen presented his settlement plans to the League's Assembly as a model that could be reproduced a number of times in the country. He also argued in favor of an international loan to Greece and wanted the Refugee Settlement Commission, which worked within the framework of the League, to put it under his control. This did not occur, and the Commission maintained a large degree of autonomy. As you know, there was this population exchange, and it was, of course, forced, but you see that Nansen tried to somehow put it in, let's say, in a policy that it wouldn't be as bad as it actually then was. And, of course, we can argue today if this is a model which later on in the 20th century came about again and again. So, but maybe we can discuss that later on. So I will come now to my closing chapter, Nansen and the resettlement plans for the Armenians, because this is something he dedicated to the last years of his life. So in August 1923, Gabriel Noradungian, president of the Armenian national delegation, addressed 2 letters to the League's Council reporting the conditions of post-genocide Armenians and asking for the extension of Nansen's mandate to his group. 1924, the Council passed a resolution asking the High Commissioner and the International Labour Organization, the ILO, to make a formal inquiry into the possibilities of creating an Armenian settlement plan in the Caucasus. 2 days later, Nansen convened a conference in Geneva where it was stated that 600,000 Armenian refugees still needed to be settled. Although repatriation was considered to be the best solution, the opposition of Soviet and Turkish authorities made it almost impossible. Also fighting against the unwillingness of some within the League of Nations circles to end its involvement in the refugee question, Nansen held private negotiations with the ILO director Albert Thomas in spring 1924 because Nansen believed that employment was central to the solution of the refugee question. The arrangement between the League and the ILO came into force on January 1925. While Nansen continued with political negotiations and issues connected with the Nansen passports, the ILO began to find employment for refugees. In the line with Nansen's mandate, the ILO would not provide direct relief to refugees, and the organization's involvement was to be temporary. So Nansen, this was, let's say, the negotiations with other institutions, and Nansen wanted to see what he can do in Soviet Armenia itself. So he visited Armenia in June 1925, and you can see this is the map. The maps and the pictures I will show you now are all in Nansen's book. I will show you later on the titles. So Nansen and his team, they came from Tbilisi. So that's the beginning of my presentation. And then they went to Gumri, or at this time, Soviet Armenia, it was called Leninakan. And then they traveled here, this way. This is Zadabarabat. And then they traveled from here with cars to Yerevan, and then just around this road here, and then back to Gumri. So this was his tour, and I will tell you the details of his tour and what he saw there and what he expected there. So Nansen visited Armenia in June 1925 and proposed a settlement plan with a modest plan for an area where refugees could be settled. The League created a commission for the settlement of Armenian refugees. However, this body did not produce any concrete results, and the proposed settlement scheme was abandoned, mainly because there was no interest by the countries of the League of Nations to endow migration into the Soviet Union, and no one was willing to provide the funds for Nansen's plan. So that was the political situation, and you can see here this is the committee. This is the Nansen people, and these are from the Armenian side. And here in the middle, you see this is the People's Commissioner for Agriculture, Essingjan, which I talked about in the beginning. And on his way through Armenia, I mean. He stopped by an orphanage near Gumri. Maybe some of you know it. This orphanage was part of the Near East Relief. It was called City of Orphans. So we talk about 31,000, probably 31,000 orphans at this time. And so we visited this orphanage. You can see here a picture, and this is a picture of Nansen testing if the soup is okay. The children will get. So this is something he wanted to see for himself, because this is, I mean, it's in so far important that, of course, for the fundings later on, he wanted to get to have an impression of the large scale. So by the time Nansen arrived in Armenia, by the time Nansen arrived in Armenia in 1925, he was well aware of the limits of the League of Nations and the rising tensions between the new Soviet government and the West. Armenia at this time was part of the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, along with Georgia and Azerbaijan, and it was stipulated by Soviet authorities that Nansen's work could be conducted outside the framework of the League of Nations and without the with the cooperation of Soviet Armenia representatives. The country was largely rural in its basic infrastructure, already sagging under the pressure of a rising population of refugees and orphans. Yerevan, Nansen wrote, suffered from a, I quote, serious shortage of houses, and inhabitants have to live in very crowded conditions. In the villages, that were outbreaks of tuberculosis and malaria, and occasionally marauding expeditions by Kurds from the Turkish side of the border. So you see some pictures here from this traveling. So this is these are the two cars they used. You can see the plains of Sadarabad, and this is. This was part of the plan to cultivate. Of course, the irrigation canals were an important part. So this is an Arax plain. This is Yerevan with Ararat, of course, and you can see it. And I mean, you heard how Nansen described the situation there. So local officials had their hands full and informed Nansen that they would accept additional refugees, quote, if these could be brought to Armenia without costs to the country, and if outside help could be obtained to make possible the irrigation and cultivation of new land, end of quote, namely the Sadarabad Desert, for which the Armenians hoped to obtain foreign capital. The Sadarabad Desert, Nansen wrote, was, I quote, a true wilderness, an endless scorched, dry, brown plain with nothing but here and there few thistle-like tufts of camel thorn, a rough plant with sharp spikes that you approach at your peril, end of quote. Even so, the landscape was dotted with evidence of former habitation, crumbling houses and old churches, and other signs of civilization. I quote Nansen, what had made this once fertile land so desolate? Can the climate have become drier since those days? End of quote. And Nansen wondered. Leafing through records of rainfall and temperature patterns, lake water levels and other indicators, he concluded that war, not fluctuations of climate, has brought about these great changes and turned the land into desert. It would be possible then to revive Sadarabad, but to begin, the Commission had to survey the plan firsthand. So the plan was to cultivate land on the outskirts of the capital, Yerevan, and draining a marshy patch near the Arax River. All in all, he estimated that the new plan would yield 25,000 acres of fertile land and sustain 125,000 people, implementing the growth of the tobacco, silk and wine cultures and orchids, which could, I quote Nansen, yield a rich harvest of splendid fruit, chiefly apricots, peaches, plums and cherries, end of quote. The funding, Nansen hoped, could be secured through a loan, with the aid of the League of Nations, The loan would be guaranteed by the local Armenian government as well as by the Soviet state and the State Bank of Russia, and repaid by the Armenians once the new farms became profitable. After evaluating all aspects of this plan, one of the commission members, Vidkun Quisling, went to Moscow to win the Soviets' approval. Nansen returned to Europe to present the new scheme to the League of Nations and became even more determined to obtain financing for the project after a powerful earthquake struck near Gyumri in 1926. When it became evident that the Caucasian settlement scheme could not be implemented, that the members of the League of Nations showed no interest to the Armenian people, Nansen managed to settle 10,000 Armenians in Yerevan and 40,000 Armenians in Lebanon on his own, with funding out of his own pocket and close friends. These are the historical facts on what Nansen could accomplish for Armenians humanitarianly. But the 340 pages book on his travels and work in Armenia is a testimony of failure as well. A failure to grant Armenians their own homeland, a story, as most, as you well know, was politicized since the Berlin Congress in 1828. The settlement plan was a possible approach to get the Armenian question back on the table. So I have here the left one you saw in the beginning. That's the original Norwegian through Armenia. And it was translated 1 year later in 1928 into English with the interesting title Armenia and the East. And much more interesting is the German translation, betrogenes Volk. That means a people who got betrayed by someone. And this is insofar interesting that the German translation picks up the discussion of the fate of the Armenian people, especially the Armenian genocide in the interwar period in Germany. And it's the title is something, it's an accusation, if you so will, indirectly. So, and both, all of them were bestsellers, because, Nansen was a name, and it was no problem to get this on the book market. So, it seemed highly desirable to find such a solution. Nansen wrote in the foreword to Armenia and the East, I quote, "For by doing so one might hope to do something at least to procure for the Armenians that national home which the Western powers of Europe and the United States of America had pledged themselves to give the Armenian nation, and of which the League of Nations had repeatedly held out a prospect." End of quote. Looking back at the last years of his life, Nansen described the full force of realpolitik regarding the Armenians in Armenia and in the East, a thorough analysis of the Armenian question, which connects with Johannes Lepsius' early works after the Hamidian massacres. So let me close this presentation with Nansen's grim conclusion on the Armenian question, a conclusion which I think has lost none of its relevance to the present. We have seen that the Western powers of Europe and the United States of America have given words and nothing else by the way of fulfilling the promises to the Armenian people which they had made with such solemnity when they needed support in war. The nations of Europe and the statesmen of Europe are tired of the everlasting Armenian question, of course. And after all, it was only a massacred but gifted little nation with no oil fields or gold mines. Woe to the Armenian people that they ever drawn into European politics. It would have been better for them if the name Armenia had never been uttered by any European diplomats. But the Armenian people have never abandoned hope. They have gone on bravely working and waiting year after year. They are still waiting. They are waiting still. Thank you for your attention.
Now I'd like to open up the floor for question and answer. Does anybody have any questions?
Presentation was so well prepared from A to Z.
Yeah, I was a little nervous, but.
I love the ending, which is so true, which is today.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We're still so, nothing has changed in 100 years.
I do have a question in regard to passports and the country that the refugees were assigned to. Were they assigned to the country, or did they choose on their own, or?
There was, there was a kind of key, formal key to distribute them, and every country has had a quota, if you so will. It's like a little bit like today as well. I mean, today it's I think the Copenhagen quota or something like this. So. And it depended, of course, always on the countries. So that's why it was important to have this passport. But of course, some countries said, okay, this is also something to regulate our, let's say, immigrant policies. Yeah. So it has a good side and a bad side as well, if you so will. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So the League of Nations back then, were they made up of European countries, and was Turkey part of the League of Nations?
Turkey was not part of the League of Nations because Turkey was founded in 1923, so the Republic, and between the end of World War I and the foundation of the Turkish Republic, there were of course some diplomats, but there were no part of the League of Nations. But not only European countries. No, the US was also part of it, of course. Yeah. So it's a little bit like a forebearer of the United Nations today. Yeah, but you can say it, but it's
In total, how many Nansen passports were given to Armenians?
Between 15 and 30,000. 15 and 30,000. Yeah, but we don't know the exact numbers. The problem is that. You don't have the full lists of all Nansen passports because the office after Nansen dies of a heart attack in 1930, and the office stayed a little bit longer open, but then it was closed, and a lot of documents were lost during World War II. So we have some lists in the archives in Geneva, and you can take a look at them, and you can also cross-reference. We talked about it, Sida, if you have a name, for example, of Armenians who had eyewitness reports or wrote their memoirs, and they say something about a passport maybe, you can cross-reference it with the archives in Geneva. But if you are lucky, you find something. If not, not. So what I did, the numbers are from the literature and the let's say the intensive talks with some people in the archives in Geneva. And after all, we estimated between 15 and 30,000.
Can you estimate how many of them came to the USA? With that?
No, actually no. But that's because we don't know if everybody survived this kind of the passport, because there's no documentation as far as I know if they came to the US. They got new papers, but there was no mark or whatever that they were Nansen refugees. So this is you can only tell it from personal stories, and this is something I think is it's impossible actually, because you have to find relatives and then to go from there. So I think we will never know the numbers actually.
You mentioned 40,000 Armenians were settled in Lebanon.
Mhm.
Is there any archival record somewhere as to which regions they were mostly from, or is it, and their list, the names?
You mean which region they came from?
Yeah, they
or?
came from, yes.
No, no.
There's no...
No. There's, there are, of course, names, but no region also. That this was not the, let's say, the point of identification. So it was what was possible to do from the East Relief, the orphans and some families, but there's no record from where they directly came from. Maybe if we follow this path, maybe we can. We can take a look in the archives, maybe in Lebanon, and see if some refugees who settled there somehow wrote some memoirs or letters or whatever, and say where they came from. But this was not the way this identity stuff worked. And this is, of course, a problem. You can say it's a problem because this is a lack of sensibility on Nansen's side, because, of course, Armenians say, okay, we come from this area, and because they have a connection to their, let's say, regional homelands. But from the Nansen side, or from the Nansen side, it was not important. They were Armenians. So you can criticize this today, of course, I think, but that's how it worked. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, I think that concludes today's presentation. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to you, Dr. Knocke.
Thank you for your patience. Okay. I have